All right.
All right.
We are recording. I start all these the same way, Greg, and that's to say welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me here to Electrical. In some respects, I'm kind of overwhelmed at being here and seeing it in person after having seen it online all these years and, hearing music that's come out of here. What I like to do is start with the state of the state, which is to say, what is the current state of things? For those unfamiliar with you or Electrical, who are you? What do you consider yourself? And where are we at? Give the elevator pitch, I guess, to the person who doesn't know.
Well, basically, the studio was, built by Steve Albini, the former owner of the facility, back in 1997. We got complete. I started working here just as the building was bought, and they were doing clean out and demolition for constructing the studio. And so it was built out to be a full whack, fancy professional studio, 2-studio complex with as much flexibility for any band who wanted to record here, possible. So a full-fledged facility as opposed to a sort of a budget project kind of studio. And Steve was at that point coming from his home studio, which, as far as home studios go, it was a really, really nice home studio. It had professional wiring, professional equipment, really nice gear, 2 separate sort of playing rooms, but it was still a house, a studio built into a house. And he bought this building and made a fancy, nice studio. And we kind of survived the era of all the big studios collapsing in Chicago because of our clientele was more independent people coming in paying their own way, as opposed to a big label infrastructure paying for months of time for big bands coming through. So when there was a collapse of that money, we didn't really feel that hit. So now we've sort of survived to this point, being the studio that sort of like persisted and kept it up when all the other studios that are about the same size as us in Chicago have sort of disappeared. And so it's basically us and a lot of other sort of studios that are a little smaller, and some of them are more project studios that are overachieving, and some are just nice studios but just a little more conservative in size. But where we are now is basically doing the same thing that we've been doing for 27 years. I can't remember.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's crazy how long that I've been here, but how long we've been doing it. But still recording bands, still recording musicians, working with them one-on-one, not having much of a relationship with like the larger sort of infrastructure of like the labels and music industry. Like we're still 90% of the time being paid by the bands to record their work and work on their projects. And we've always lived within our means. We've inherited a lot of nice gear from when Steve was gobbling up all the nice equipment he could find in the early 90s at a time where he could pick up equipment for relatively cheap. So we have these, tons of microphones and great things that you can't afford now that we wouldn't be able to have a chance to get now. We've sort of inherited just from that voracious buying spree of his. Whenever he would record a record and get paid a decent amount of money, he would just go out and buy nice stuff, and that stuff is still here, and the microphones are still here. So we have the capabilities of this place that we've always had, and it's still recording. We're still doing records the same way that we were doing it. It's just there's more freelance engineers and producers coming through now, which has always been the goal of the place, and to have the place just humming along without the staff really having to worry too much about it. And that's kind of working out a little bit more now. When we first opened up, it was more like Steve was carrying most of the weight and doing most of the session work. And, it took a while for the studio to get its own sort of sea legs, and, the engineers that work here to bring in their own work. And over the years, we found a way for him to sort of not work as much and and just have other, through other freelance engineers and other engineers in the studio just picking up more work. It just started to evolve and turn itself into a functioning, self-sustaining place, which is great. 15 years ago, it was basically Steve doing most of the heavy lifting on his shoulders for keeping the building alive. And fortunately, that's not the case, or that wasn't the case, for the last 5 or 7 years. It's been he could sort of take a rest here and there, as opposed to trying to bowl through and make all the money.
And Steve passed away, unfortunately. How long has it been?
Last May. So it's almost going to come up about a year.
Coming up on a year. Yeah. And for the audience, if you haven't listened to my interview with Steve, I highly encourage you to do so. I'll say this. I felt like, and I said this to Greg before we started recording, I feel like really found that in interviewing him, just his humanity, and there was a sweetness to him. And I always felt there was this professionalism to him, his reverence for bands in terms of how he operated, how he treated the recording profession, very much like a plumber, very, very working class, not to piggyback off my name here, but it truly, there was something about him that to this day, I kind of hold him in high regard in terms of how things could be. And the fact that even though he did do a few, key records, Nirvana's In Utero and some other records that really put him on the national map or the world map, for the most part, as you said, the day-to-day is mostly, independent bands, and the bands are paying the bills. Anyways,
yeah,
it's an honor to be here in a place that he built, and with the help of many other people. And so let's focus on you. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in the suburbs north of here in Chicago. Basically started taking an interest in recording pretty much from the Beatles, just being fascinated with the Beatles and following kind of just obsessively like what they were all about, and just obsessively listening to their records. And I had some friends that were into just punk rock bands and hardcore bands, which sounds like it doesn't make sense with the Beatles background, but eventually, I'd make friends, and I'd get exposed to some more interesting work and music in the area. And there's lots of like basement and garage shows like around Chicago that like a teenager could go to and just sweat it out with whatever band's playing. And at that point I got sort of a sense of just this sort of community of people that were just fully supportive. Like it took me a while to get it, but thinking that I was like an outsider in this weird clique of musicians and friends. But once I had sort of understood, it was just like a whole friend scene that was just completely supportive and helping each other out. And that just seemed like an amazing culture, an amazing sort of scenario that I wasn't aware of. And then I went to Montana for a couple of years to go to school, ironically, where Steve grew up, or where he lived for a lot of his childhood. And after 2 years there, I was just recording bands on the side with whatever garbage I'd picked up, microphones and 4-track, a friend's 4-track, and I picked up a 1/4-inch 8-track and like an old TAC mixer, TAC, it's like a little 8-channel giant mixer, and I started recording friends' bands and just doing that for fun in like whatever space I could find. And I bumped into a friend who was in a band called US Maple, Al Johnson, and when I was back in Chicago for spring break, and I asked him if he knew of any like studios that were like looking for interns, or somewhere I wanted to like finally like actually go to a studio and try to work at a studio or do something at a studio. And he gave me Steve's phone number, which I knew he had recorded with Steve and his band Shorty, but I was not expecting that. And he gave me Steve's phone number. It's like, yeah, just give Steve a call. And I'm like, all right, fine. And I went back to Montana and called Steve, and I just called the phone number. Steve answered, and I'm like, hi, I'm thinking of, I'm going to go to school in Chicago at Columbia College, which I hadn't planned yet. And I was like, do you offer any internships? And he's like, yeah, sure. Like, when do you need it? And he just sort of like wanted me to tell him when I needed to do this thing, and then, invited me to do it. And so at that point, I planned to move back to Chicago and go to Columbia College and intern at Steve's house, which was where his studio was at the time. but yeah, all through this time, I was always like picking up random stuff and recording friends and doing whenever my dad would go out of town. I'd turn the house into a studio and just like round up as much mics and cables and stuff from whatever friends that had any, and we'd try to record as much stuff as possible and experiment that way.
You have brothers or sisters?
Yeah, I have 2 older brothers and a sister.
And in your household growing up, what was the role of music or technology?
Yeah, so like when I grew up, music was kind of a chore. Like not listening to music, but like playing music. It was like you have to pick an instrument when you're in 4th or 5th grade, and like if you pick it, you got to do it until you're in the 8th grade. Like no matter what happens, whatever you pick in 5th grade, that's what you're doing until you're 8th grade. And I picked trumpet because my older brother had a trumpet. I think I wanted to do trombone, but my mom pushed me to to do trumpet because I already had a trumpet because my older brother, and I hated. Hated it. It was probably good that I did it, but I just thought of it as work, and I wasn't in a band at that early age, and I wasn't even in a band like in high school. I was in some screw around bands in high school, but we didn't do like anything special, or we didn't do anything like play a bunch of shows. I just sort of like throughout my whole life, I do have times where I'm in bands playing music, and the only time I'm doing that is kind of like as a tourist. I like going, I like being involved in the process, but I'm not like obsessively playing and writing in my own. I just love the process of like the music being made and recorded, and I like just seeing that through, and I like being with friends, and so it was all about that, and it's all about like making a thing, making sort of a fun experience and a fun recording, and doing that sort of stuff. I didn't really I saw being in a band and playing music as a means to that end, as opposed to like for its own sake of being in the band and being on tour playing shows. But
when did you become conscious of recording or production, or like take an interest in how things sounded?
I had the Beatles' Rubber Soul and a cassette of the White Album. And I think the White Album is a wonderful entry point for the Beatles, oddly, because you just get like this multi-pack of like different songwriting samples and like recording sample. You get like the whole package of like styles and personalities all wrapped up into this nice big long record, and you hear these intense, thick, rich songs like I'm So Tired or something that just like has like a lot of like sonic boldness and just enticement like just built into it. And then you have like these weird pop songs that are just like polished and perfect, and you have other things that are just a little more raw. I would just obsessively listen to that record over and over again, just because there'd be just so many things that would be happening that I just had no idea like how that happened or what that sound came from. And a lot of people like point to Sgt. Pepper's or some other record for those sort of like sonic collages, and I kind of gravitated towards this record just because I feel like I could identify what the weird sound effect was in Sgt. Pepper or something like that, but there'd be a weird sound or just a quality to the sound in like the White Album that seemed more appealing to me, and that seemed like that, which I would eventually learn would be just sort of accidental or bleed from some other mics, like some live vocal while they're doing drums, and that's why there's this big, huge drum sound, this slap back sound, just because it's bleeding through the vocal mic or something like that. But it was just more interesting to me to hear that sort of accidental, cool, wide, explosive sort of sound from a band that's like a pop band.
At that time, did you take more interest in listening and sonic exploration on that front as compared to what you described as, the chore of playing trumpet?
Yeah. I definitely was more curious about recording than playing, for sure. Like, and I'd abuse my friends, like make them, not abuse them. They're more than willing to like participate, but I'd get like inklings for how something was done, and then just like experiment with that, like trying with what I had. Like, I had a Radio Shack PZM microphone, which was awesome, and I had a couple other random microphones that I picked up at a thrift store, and like would just trying to recreate sort of these things that I heard on these records, and and that was like more fun to me. And then just piecing stuff together and having the idea of like completing an idea or a project was like was a fun, appealing thing to me, as a just, starting from somewhere that like nothing's happened, nothing's totally figured out, and then ending up playing the song or some recording for someone else, and this is the finished thing, and you can appreciate it and hear, there's weird little tidbits about it that I know about that you don't know about, and there's like but it has like an effect that, on the listener that maybe they don't know about, but it's just sort of a thing that we executed that worked out well. And I had that like sort of sensation like early on in my, teenage years, that I wanted to keep kind of doing that.
There's the active listening and the obsessiveness that comes with that, but then there's the extracurricular, because we're trying to expand beyond that, meaning you listen, but then you seek knowledge, whether it be magazines. Obviously today we have YouTube and everything the internet brings. Mm-hmm. Where were you seeking that extra knowledge to bolster what you were listening to?
There's like a extracurricular club that had to do with the jazz band at my high school. And they had a little, like recording setup there that had a 1/2-inch 8-track and then an ADAT that just came out. That was like the new fancy thing, the ADAT. And a Mackie board, or a Tascam mixing board. And the guy who ran the club was, the person who knew how to record things and would record like all the stuff that went on at the school. And I just joined that and tried to be around that as much as possible and like learn from people. Like people would come back from college to help out during, certain concerts or whatever. And I'd kind of just be there to help out and grill them with questions. And that's when I kind of learned about what EQ was and what a mic preamp was and all that. And just get the basics from a human being, like what these things were. Because I didn't really I think I read Mix magazine, but they were talking about Neve consoles and more about the story of a session as opposed to like how things work and how things, there wasn't really I wasn't exposed to a textbook or a book on how to do stuff. And so the only things that I used for like gaining information were like the people that were in that little, group. And then I would meet someone with a 4-track and I'd just sort of talk to them about like bouncing and whatever weird stuff. They would record demos and I'd get curious and try to be inquisitive about it. But yeah, there's a lot of, in my life, there's a lot of reflection on like how I kind of learned about lots of different things, with respect to like now, and just going onto YouTube and like, if I have like a specific oven that I have in my apartment, like, and it's not igniting the gas when it's not turning on, and you hear the igniter going on and the gas is popping on, but it's not turning on. Within 5 minutes, I can know what's wrong with it and what to buy. And like, back in my day, no, it's like, that's like when I get these like back in my day moments where I'm just like, I had to sort of like find someone to either talk to me about it or do it autodidactically, like go to like a library and like get confused by looking at these books that like, what's this envelope? What does that mean? Right. Like, I just want, there is a perfect book I sort of found, like, that I'm sure a lot of people know about. It's like the Yamaha Sound Reinforcement Handbook. Right. Which is like, yeah, it's like perfect right down the middle. Anyone can read it, and it's a very, very like, it gets as detailed as you need to get about it and very specific, but like you can read it and you can get all the basic sort of information that way, and it's not intimidating at all for anyone's curious. It's like a perfect size and density. It's a nice thing, and there's some corny tips and stuff, but like it just gets you launched into the path of doing whatever you need to do.
In your quest for knowledge about recording at that time, were you a bit of a lone wolf, or were there other contemporaries or friends that were also interested in this?
I was pretty much, I didn't have any close friends that were interested in recording necessarily, but other than just getting their own band recorded, and they're more like hardcore punk bands that like were proudly trying to make it as rough and simple as possible. So there wasn't like much experimentation. It's like, kind of embarrassment if it took 2 or 3 takes to do a song, and not much like obsessing over like, making a creative sort of like making it like that, creating like a sonic scape or anything like that. It's not, there's no Pink Floyding. It was all just raw, bare bones, like Minor Threat style, just like those were the heroes, like just doing something simple and flat and forward. And so like that was like kind of that was the group of people I was around. But also, Ween was a popular band, and other like, bands that were experimenting were like, other friends that like did like experimenting and doing things, but they weren't recording engineers. They're just more like musicians playing and fans of that music. And it just took me to find people who also like, recording their own music or other people's music, to try to like learn off them, which is kind of tough, because if there are people working engineers and producers, like you don't really like stumble across them that often. They're usually in the studio hidden away and they're not talking to teenagers about anything, typically. I don't know.
Were you identifying the players? You mentioned Minor Threat, so were you aware of Don Zientara and others like Don?
Just in a vague sense, seeing their name. I was aware of Steve, because Steve had like a sort of kind of like a larger presence in this area, and I had new friends that were just fans of the music. I think he has that connection with the bands, Big Black and Rape Man, and at the time, and then Shellac had just started. So there's like the band element that like people were fans of, and then like the recording side of that was sort of carried with that, or vice versa. So like there was a connection there that was easy to sort of connect with or hear or remember. Mitch Easter and like REM, I'd just be like vaguely familiar, and I just would not know, or Brian Eno or Tony Visconti. I just know these names, but I wouldn't have any clue as to who was responsible for what. It's like, is that David Bowie, or is that Tony Visconti, or is that like, who came up with this idea? And it's not like I wasn't like reading. I wasn't even sure if there was much information out there about like just digging into like session, like this is like how this sound was made, and when we took a speaker and flipped it inside out and hit it with like a tambourine, and that's how that sounded. Like none of that didn't penetrate to me anyways. But
were you interested in the sounds that you heard on more commercial records, or were you kind of focused entirely on?
No, I had definitely. It took a while to get interested. For me, it took a while to get, into the sort of bare bones, simplistic sort of production style that's in a lot of the like post-punk independent world. Like, well, at least when I was a kid, I was dazzled by all sorts of studio circus tricks. Like I remember like listening to a Mr. Bungle record, or and just that's like all dazzle, basically, just like sharp turns and tons of sound effects and really, really like manicured sound. And I was really into that. I was really curious about, these things, and like, how do you do that? how do you have like a team of people that just like comes up with that stuff and executes it so well? And like, just hearing about that sort of, and it took me a while to sort of go from like, gymnastics music and gymnastics production to appreciate sort of like a more simpler approach, and having a more, like hearing like bands like the Jesus Lizard and like Big Black, and it took a while to get like into that zone where like, all right, when are they going to do something? They've been playing this part for 3 minutes now, and it's like, when's something going to happen? Like, and then just like, and then getting it, it's like, oh, there's like a groove and there's a swing here. Like, the Jesus Lizard, like people don't think of as a band that swings, but like, Mac McNeely is like a great drummer who actually like swings. You could play that beat really robotically and have it come off really, plain and like, white bread, sort of technically done well, but like there's like a groove and a swing to that stuff, and I feel like that's like a weird secret sauce that worked for them. But like, yeah, you'd have a song that just be like 2 parts and 5 or 10 minutes, and it took a while to sort of like learn how to like appreciate that sort of stuff as opposed to, proggy, hyper technical, stuff where you just watch people just achieve things with the music as opposed to like do something that really stirs you.
Was there ever a time where you started to think, I could do this professionally? I could be one of those people recording these bands?
In a way, yeah, because I did have that when I started listening to more sort of independent music and listening to more homegrown, home-built music, like I feel like that happened early on. So I always had this idea that like, I'd have friends that would release, records, and I'd see them. There was this band in the basement, and there'd just be this 30 or 50 people in the basement watching this band, and they'd have a 7-inch that they'd be selling. I'm like, oh, you can just do this. And I'd realize that like the person that recorded the 7-inch did it on their 4-track in their own garage. And it's like, I early on, I realized like it was something that could easily happen, and that you didn't have this weird barrier to entry, like where you need to make a record that costs like $200,000 to do over 3 months. And, so I feel like I managed to skip that sort of mental like hurdle of like thinking that like this can't happen somehow. Like I always thought that like it's literally just a matter of like, are you a band that like people like to watch, and are you willing to go out on tour and be a band? I think that was like the biggest difference. Like, if you're a band that's willing to do a lot of work and you're have some appeal somehow, like where people voluntarily want to decide to go see you, like that's pretty much, you can put a record out and it'll be something that like, won't be just for yourself, and people will listen to it, and it'll be recorded. It could be recorded really well in a fancy studio where you spend a lot of time getting everything just right, or it could be done really simply as like kind of a live record. But it'll still be like a real record that people will, have, and that you released. And I just didn't have that. I think I came of age at that time where pretty much anyone could do it. I mean, it's obviously a lot easier now. Like you don't have to make 1,000 records as your minimum when you're making a record. You can make 100 records now as opposed to 1,000 records. But like, in my 20s, the bands that could just sell maybe 200 or 300 records, like had to print up 1,000.
Yeah.
And sat on 700 records when they broke up a few months later. And that'd be a thing. But so I didn't really think, I got super excited when it actually started to happen. Like when I recorded a band that was, we're putting this record out, and like, this is for a 10-inch that we're doing, like, and that was like exciting. And I didn't really believe it until it actually happened. And there was actually a record in my hand, and like, this is actually a thing that like, I recorded and it's done. And that was certainly like a super exciting sort of like, okay, this is real, this happened, this is like a actual thing. And I like that aspect of, I still appreciate, I get giddy when I get like a finished record. Like I got a pile of records on the shelf there that bands send me after, the record comes out, and I wait till there's a suitcase full, and then I bring it home. And then, that way I can have like a minute before my kids destroy them to appreciate the production and the artwork and all that sort of stuff. And still I get giddy when I put a needle down on a record that I recorded. It's like, okay, I remember doing this thing, and I hear it coming out of this, I hear it off the record itself, and it's like actually a physical, real thing. And it's a little bit of a bummer if you get excited about a project and it just comes out digitally. It's like, I want to put it on a thing.
Yeah, it is such a strange difference.
A tactile.
When you get the CD or you get the album, or the vinyl rather, it like, I don't know, I get a little bit of a thrill when I see my name on stuff like that. And, but when the digital comes out, you're like, oh, okay, great. I'll post about it. But, it's not the same thrill.
Yeah, because I'm not excited. I'm looking at a computer screen, and I guess I associate other things with the computer screen. And it's like, okay, it's only going to live there, and it's not going to live there forever. And like, as much as everybody thinks Apple and Spotify and everything will be there forever, like, everybody thought Sears was going to be around forever. And there's going to be a time where Apple's going to go bankrupt, and someone's, like, going to lose all their, I mean, no one's going to lose anything. It'll be somewhere, but it's just not going to be what it is. In 10 years, my kids aren't going to be going on to Spotify or iTunes to listen to music. They'll think about it, and their chip will turn on and play the music in their brain probably in 10 years.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Not my kids, though.
So let's talk about the start of the internship with Steve. What were the early days of that like?
Super exciting. Like the first time I showed up at his house, and by then I'd like known, I listened to tons of records that were recorded at the house, and I had in my head kind of what I thought was going on at the house. And in my head, for some reason, I thought it was like a lot simpler. Like maybe he'd record bands with like 6 or 10 microphones, and he was like some magician somehow getting that sound with, drum sound with like 4 or 5 microphones or something. I was super curious and didn't know anything about how he did stuff, but I was big fans of the records that he did already and fans of the bands that he recorded, and him and Bob Weston, who also worked there at the time. I showed up at the door and like rang the doorbell a bunch, and like no one was there. And then eventually like he poked his head out, and he didn't have his glasses on. He looked like he just woke up. And it's like, can I help you? I'm like, I'm Greg Norman. I'm here to, start my internship. I talked to you on the phone. He's like, oh yeah, come in. And he opens up the door and he walks away, and he's in his tidy whities and naked. And he like storms into the living room and then just darts into his bedroom and shuts the door. And I'm in the living room and like, all right, I guess what do I do? And I hear some noises in the kitchen. And I walked back to the kitchen, and Tom Zalewski, who used to be kind of the studio manager back then, he was also the bass player in Tar, a band from Chicago. But Tom was kind of doing all the day-to-day stuff at the old house and also at the new building, which is now the new studio. Not new studio, but the studio. So I walked into the kitchen, and he's just sort of there getting his morning coffee. And he looks up and he's like, who the fuck are you? I'm like, I'm here for an internship. And he's like, he obviously wasn't told about it. And he's like, all right. And then he just goes straight into like the routine of like, when you show up, we got to clean up after the bands. It's just like any other studio, but it was like Steve's house. Steve's residence was basically his bedroom. And the rest of it was the studio basically like a common area for bands to like, crash when they're on tour. And people who worked at the house or, in the studio part of the house would just be milling around and doing stuff. It was, there's always people coming and going. And upstairs there was a control room. In the attic, it was a brick bungalow and kind of a mile away from here. And in the attic there was a control room with a Neotech console, a Studer 24-track, and all the fixings, like the nicest outboard gear. And in the basement there was a little live room where the drums would be, and then like a dead room, which was a concrete brick walled in sort of space inside the basement. And that's where just, hordes of bands were recorded. And I walked in there, and the band Pegboy, a Chicago band, great band, they were in the middle of recording. And I went down there, and they're like a punk rock band, guitar, bass, drums, singer. And, and I think like, oh, this can be kind of like one of those sort of setups I was curious about, probably pretty basic. And I go down there and I see like there's 16 mics on the drums. And it's just like, oh, this is like a lot more complicated than I thought. And like, immediately got exposed to all the sort of nicest sort of microphones and gear. And then the little community around that house, the people that worked there and all the people that would stop by and the bands were always the nicest, friendliest, generous people I'd ever met. Like no matter what was going on, they were always like asking me what's up with me, like what am I up to, and like, do you want a record? Here's a record. It's like that, like unflappably nice and generous, culture around that sort of space, and almost like it's just like a weird hippie commune kind of weird sort of thing.
Did you feel at home? Did you feel comfortable in the environment?
I mean, at first, obviously, I was nervous and I didn't want to like fuck up or do anything weird. But yeah, immediately I felt like enabled and empowered to sort of like hang out there and help out late. Like I wasn't like bothering anyone. It seemed like I wasn't bothering anyone, so I'd just be there a lot, and I'd stay late and watch sessions happen, progress through from start to finish and hang out with the old tech that used to be there. There's a little shop in the back of the upstairs, and the tech was always up to, like, modifying and repairing out the horde of gear that was, coming in. There was always like something to do, and if there wasn't something happening in the studio part of the house, I'd go hang out with the tech and see if he had anything that I could work on or do. And that's kind of a little bit of what started like my fascination with doing tech work and repairing stuff, and just trying to make myself handy and useful. Like there could be an excuse for me to be at a place if I can like help out in some way. Like if I'm handy doing other stuff, I can also, I don't know. I wasn't premeditated about it. I was actually just curious about like seeing this really fancy, I'd like, what's that in the corner? There'd be like some weird tape machine in pieces. And I'm like, what was that thing? And I'd never seen it before, and just grilling people as much as possible. Steve, I remember one night I was hanging up in the control room while band was tracking, and I was asking him different questions, and he was just like, wow, it's like this, most interns don't say anything or don't ask any questions. I'm like, and I was kind of surprised, like, what are you doing here then? But like, it was kind of like a reveal. Like, I guess I was like, oh, am I being annoying or something? He's like, no, this is good. Like, I'm actually like learning something by explaining it to you. Like, it's like I kind of like learned, like, he was like, it's actually helping me by explaining to you, formulate the thoughts, because I don't know, whatever. I'd be asking about everything, so I'm sure I'd asked about stuff that he'd never verbalized before or something. But
how long were you guys at the house before you started to think, okay, this, we got to get out of this house?
By that point, he'd already bought this place, and he'd been there, I think, since '88, and this was 1996. So he had already bought this place, and keeping, he was going to build this studio. And when I was interning, they needed like just regular laborers. So like Tom Zalewski, like he's like, both of them are like, if you need any extra work or if you need any work at all, like you can just go over to the building and do demolition or do whatever needs to happen over there. So,
and just so I'm clear about the timeline, when you arrived as an intern at the house, how long were you an intern there, or working alongside Steve when this studio started to when this property was purchased?
So yeah, the summer of 1996, summer of 1996 is when I started interning at the house, but also starting to do construction stuff here. So like when I wasn't interning there, I'd be at school or working here. And Columbia College I was going to, all the classes were at 5 or 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock at night. It was all night time, except for a few times there'd be like some daytime classes. But so I could work either here all day doing filthy construction work, or go to the house and do intern kind of work, which maybe a couple days a week or something. I had like basically a full-time job doing the construction stuff here eventually, and the interns, so like I'd just be continuously going back to the house to help out, do this or that. After a certain point, like Steve's like, you want to just work for the company? It's like we were like sweeping out in the lounge there, like sweeping up a bunch of debris. Like he was helping out, and he, like, there's a specific moment where he's like, do you want to just, what are you going to do after you graduate or whatever? Or I forget what exactly the wording. Like he was asking me like what my future is, and I'm like, it's like, well, I'm going to try to record and do stuff. And he's like, well, do you want to just, would you like to just stay here? Would you mind staying here and working for us for the rest of the time, or for when we get this place up and running? And I'm like, of course. It basically just morphed into like a full-time position at this building when we were getting closer and closer to opening Studio B, which was the first studio we opened up. And there wasn't really like a stopping point. Like just the internship turned into just paid salary, but I was also getting money working here. So it was, instead of getting like hourly paid for hourly labor, I just got onto the salary.
Which is interesting, because I think some others in similar positions in different parts of the world, they do a stint with one person and then they move on. And
Yeah.
were there moments at which you thought, I want to move on, or were you just content to just stay?
Steve and I would do stuff together and work on things together occasionally. But for the most part, I was on my own, doing my own thing. And also in the studio when it first opened up, like I was so new to recording, like I'd record my friends and do that sort of stuff for free. But like I didn't have like a repertoire or like a catalog of people, of like projects that would like give anyone really the confidence to spend like $600 a day here on me. I was like the first sort of like assistant engineer, myself and another person named Rob Botchnick, who was another person that was doing the same thing I was doing at the same time. We were like the go-to assistant or staff engineers for like just off the street kind of work for the studio, which was really great. Like those assisting days were great because you'd see a freelance engineer or producer come through and they'd just have like a completely different work method and workflow and attitude towards things, and you'd get like that constant flow of like different styles and work habits, and so you get that sort of like curiosity satiated in a little bit. But like as far as like me wanting to like, you know, I'd always had like a outside recording thing going on outside of the studio, just because the bands I was friends with and the bands I was working with, you know, their budgets were, you know, in such a state where they could scrounge a few $100s together. And
Yeah.
so much to the point where I was always doing outside recording at wherever we could do it, at lofts or other spaces. And eventually I bought a house on the south side of Chicago for $75,000. Like you could get a loan back in 1999, making 25 grand a year, like to buy a house. Like it was like something that shouldn't have happened. Like it was one of those loans that they shouldn't have given to anyone. And so I got this house. And the reason why I bought this house is I wanted to have a space that I could record, you know, all the bands that I wanted to record, and to have a place to record them that wasn't a loft or a rented space, because all my friends would have these spaces and then they'd sell the building and all the build out that they did would be thrown out, and like they wasted all their money. And two years after they got everything all set, they just get kicked out of this place. And I'm just like, I want to be in control of my own destiny.
A great lesson you learned early on that I preach about on the show is like, if you're going to open a studio, try to have control over the building.
Yeah, it's like, it was tragic in a lot of these cases. Like some of these studios would be around for a while and a lot of bands would record there, and you invest so much of your blood and sweat and money into a thing, and then like, you know, a landlord would call and be like, you got to be out in 6 months or, you know, 2 months, and I just didn't want to do that. So I went like in the middle of nowhere in the south side of Chicago. Like we could still buy a house for relatively cheap. My mortgage was less than my rent. The previous apartment that I was at, it was like $600, and I split it with, you know, my roommate, you know, who lived with me down there, and then I built out my own little space. And the whole idea was I could track a band for 2 days at Electrical, get like the bulk of the expensive heavy duty rhythm tracks done, and then we just do all the time consuming stuff in my basement in my studio, like all the vocal overdubs, guitar overdubs, tambourine, and, you know, all the different like just time eater sort of stuff, and do the record that way. And that way I could record in a nice studio at least for most of it, and still manage to get like, you know, bands. I had like a method. I'd just sort of like, I'd give you like $100. I'd give you like a really, really cheap deal to record your record if you just spend the first couple of days at Electrical, so we get like the bulk of it done in a really nice way. And I picked up like a couple of broken tape machines, fixed them up, and so I had a 24 track that was compatible with here. And this was still in the era where it was all 24 track, and you couldn't really like do much. Pro Tools was a thing, but it was expensive at that time if you wanted a full whack system. So like, you know, finding an old broken 24 track was an option. And I got like an old MCI JH24, and it had like a couple of bugs, and I was able to fix them up. I had like a whole graveyard of tape machines at this house eventually. Like the living room was full of like broken ATRs, broken like MCI machines. It was just kind of like a learning kit in school on repairing stuff, but that's another story. But like, I just used that place as sort of the overflow for like the bands that could barely afford a couple days here or just do all the record at my house. There was never going to be a situation where I wasn't going to record. And like when I was here, I was like, I can't get bands to come to record here because I'm a new kid who has like no like, history. And so like, but I would always want to like make sure that I could keep recording. And that was like the goal there. And I did a bunch of records that I wouldn't have been able to do had I not been able to do that weird sort of hybrid situation. Like it was like a total enabler of, to let me record a bunch of records, which is really nice.
And I mean, what a great position to be in, because I mean, you have this independent situation where you're making a little money, but you're also learning a great deal from Steve and in the early days of this building, of building a space like this, and just all the experiences that come with building a studio with Steve Albini.
Yeah, I knew nothing before starting the construction here. By the time we got done, I like knew at least enough to get into a lot of trouble: plumbing, electrical work, carpentry, drywall, all of it. Because you do all of that when you're building, a DIY studio. You're dipping your toes into everything. And thankfully, we would have like some friend in the music community that was like, the actual tradesman. So like, there'd be a friend who was a plumber who would be like, okay, I'm going to do the heavy duty stuff. You do this. This is how you do it. and an electrician who's like, for the heavy duty electrical work, there was like a contractor to do all that sort of stuff. But Pete Conway, who also has who's the moniker Flower in Minneapolis, he was like Steve's old friend. And he came down week after week after week. He's like a master carpenter, and he was like the head carpenter for this whole studio and did all the heavy duty work. And he would just he would just show us how to do stuff and put us on a task. And it was just great. It was like going to like a school about all that sort of stuff. And then seeing people problem solve and work together and communicate together in a non-aggressive, like, screaming match kind of way, like you see in like a construction site where you have subcontractors who are trying to screw over people or take advantage of people. Like you got basically just friends helping another friend build this thing that's cool that they might use later. So like there's not like that weird, we lucked out that, or not lucked out. They're just, it's the product of just being part of this community that was
right. It's one thing to spend that time with Steve and learn about recording, but to be around people like that, building something of this level, of this intensity. I mean, just, in our tour, and those of you who haven't seen the tour, you got to watch the tour. It's a separate video. Just the grounding and all of that business we saw in the basement alone. I mean, that's an indicator of, what else is going on in this building.
Yeah, and just, seeing how they interact, and like, a lot of times it'd be the first time I'd meet someone, who's kind of a legend in the in the US too, but also the Chicago music community. And like, just, everybody in that, scene would always, have a real job, quote unquote, and then they'd go off on tour for, weeks or months at a time, and then come back and go back to their trade job. And it was just nice to like interact with them and communicate with them and work with them and bond in this weird project together and have these moments. And I made really, good friends with, Pierre Kedzie, who's the bass player of Naked Ray Gun and that band Peg Boy. And like, he helped me do the plumbing at my house on the south side. And, just because he was here working on the plumbing here, and, I met him, and I also met him. He was in the band that was the first band that I saw recording at Steve's house, and then just met him over and over again. And, it's like, hey, I got a thing, I'd like to record. I'll like do some plumbing for you for, that's how like it's definitely like, there's a lot of bartering and stuff. And I've been involved in like studio build outs where it's just all pro, contractor crew. And it's just like, there's not that vibe there. There's not that connection to like, I hung that door and like, oh, that's still a little fucked up looking because I did like, I didn't know what the fuck I was doing, but it's there and it's still working, that kind of thing. It's like contractors come in, they swoop through, and it's like, might as well build an office building, and it's not really there's not that connection. But I don't think there's a lot of studios out there that are like built that way. For the most part, like from what I know, most people are like hands-on, and you know, I'm sure like in the upper echelon of like studios in Nashville and LA and you know that sort of stuff. It's just you hire it and get it done as quick as possible. But like for the most people that I deal with, it's just, you know, at some point you run out of money and you got to do something.
Right. You employ your friends that are tradespeople, and you mix it up with a little DIY, and it takes on this character and this personality that is indicative of the community. And what's really just fascinating to me is those early days of your time here, how that's built up. You know, it's those relationships that are forged, that knowledge that is gained, that, you know, here we are, however many years later. Would we say it was 27 years later?
28 years.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm sure that the lessons and the relationships that came from that moment all those years ago, like, are still in some ways in operation.
Oh yeah.
And you know, those people kind of come in and out of your life.
Yeah, and definitely. And back to your question about like, did I ever feel the urge to sort of like leapfrog to another thing? So like, because I had this sort of side gig, I guess, going on the whole time, and that side gig is kind of like grew as I got like a better, you know, catalog of records done, and people would start calling me about records that I've done for other people, and the clients that I deal with are better funded and, you know, have more of an established base. And I do a lot of freelance sort of like travel and recording and go to other studios and do stuff. So I have like that side of me is like satiated in a way. Like, you know, I have half the records, or maybe a little less than half the records, I've either done like completely outside of electrical, or, you know, half outside of electrical. So I've never felt like contained inside this capsule.
That independent streak is, as you say, it's satiated.
Yeah.
So you don't ever feel like, oh man, I've had enough of this. I've been here long enough. I got to go.
Right. And those tendencies, like, you know, because there's a budget and there's a cap to how much you can make at this studio, and like any studio. And there are obviously lots of benefits to working here, and there was for me as a young person. And one of the fringe benefits was always the agreement that like most of the people that worked here were always in bands, and the bands would go on tour, and that was kind of part of the deal. It's like you're not getting paid much, but you get to take like 6 weeks off for your band tour or whatever, you know, and you get medical. That was the other fringe benefit. Like, it was rare to get health insurance as working at a studio.
Oh, Steve provided health insurance?
Yeah, we had full whack health insurance, and that was like a main thing to keep some, you know, like feel okay about like, okay, I'm, you know, not making a lot of money, but at least like this is covered, and at least, you know, there's time off for this. But like I wasn't in a band. I wouldn't go on tour for 6 or 10 weeks, but I would take that time and record bands. I would go elsewhere and record bands or do other stuff and augment the, you know, to do the project and do a fun thing. I love traveling and going to do these sessions at weird studios, even if the studio's kind of crappy and falling apart. It's like, it's a challenge and interesting to do it, you know, to work in a new environment. And
gives you a whole new appreciation for how this is run and built.
Steve and I, almost every time we come back from like because he'd go travel for some recording gigs too, like anytime we'd go somewhere and then come back, and just like, because we have like a policy in this studio, we have a policy of just like, if anything's broken, you get it out of the room. So like any rack gear, any instrument, any amplifier, just get it out of the studio. Don't even like tempt anyone to like to try it. And like, that's like a big pet peeve of ours. Like Steve and I, like we'd go to a studio and he'd have all this beautiful gear, these fancy microphones and everything. And then you start using it and it's like half of it's, you know, making noises and half of it's not working. And it's just like, what the fuck?
Right.
So like when we come home, or when you would come home to this studio and we do our first session, it's like all the channels work, all the switches work, like all the...
It's good to be home.
And we did pamper ourselves just by maintaining, like, this was kind of the level of care that like most studios had. And we kind of just stayed there while everybody else sort of just lived with a lot worse. And it's, with all these independent studios that, it's just one person holding the whole ship up, it's hard to justify spending $6,000 on new switches for your console when you're like, it gets to the computer, it's fine. It's like, just don't touch it after you have it set in the right spot. It's like you go to a studio and you use the switches and you use the buses and you're like, oh, you're using the buses. We haven't done that in a while. It's like,
so the internship turns into full-time employment, and obviously your recording chops over the years grow to what they are now, and a lot of lessons learned along the way about recording and such. But one lesson I want to ask you about is, because we talk about some of these other studios and how poorly run some of them are, unfortunately, but what are the financial lessons that you learned about running a studio in all of these years, from not only your experience, but observing Steve and observing how this is done?
Financial lessons, there's a couple of things happening. I've always been like sort of thrifty and finding something that's close to being garbage and then knowing that like it's not garbage and finding a way to make it work again, which is kind of handy to know if you're trying to do studio stuff, because buying things that work, especially in this weird vintage fetish climate, it's like you have to be rich to be able to afford the basic level, some basic level like fancy gear. Being able to repair things, I think it's saved us many times over and over. Like, we've always been like a subsistence kind of business, basically covering our costs and never shooting up to the moon with any sort of profitable year or going completely tanking a year. It's always been kind of like a little bit up here, a little bit down there, a little up here, it's just averaging out, paying the bills. And a couple of times we've had like some really dry spells. We've been able to stay alive by Steve sort of selling something that, we had like an excess of microphones or some sort of something that we've just been holding on to that's just like a surplus kind of thing, and we're able to just pull that out and sell it. But like, just being a little bit thrifty. Steve never like concerned himself with money, which was a problem as far as like, I think he felt icky like just even talking about it. But like, and I was kind of the big regulating factor as far as like arguing with him constantly about buying just gear. He would always buy microphones and stuff, and I'd just be like, yelling at him about that, and like got to a point where I was like, we don't need these things. Stop buying these other things. We're just spending money when we don't need to. And we implemented sort of like a policy of like checking with everybody else before buying stuff, and just because it's like, oh, that's for sale, and I'm getting it. He was a very, that's how he sort of worked in this world. Like, he's always picking up stuff as he saw it, and he was buying for himself for the most part. But like, when the studio became a studio with a staff of people and like a business that has a budget limitation, and it's not just him and his personal money anymore, he'd have these decisions. I'd be making decisions about like, can we afford to like get this or that repaired, or spare part for the Studer machines? Like, you need to get like a thing for this and thing for that, and it costs this much money. You can't just like buy a microphone that's like $6,000 or something, which he would in the past be able to do on his own because it's just him. Seeing him sort of like, be sort of wild and carefree, and which he had like an ability to sort of raise money at the same time. Like, occasionally he would get a fancy project that would pay a ton of money, or he'd, win a poker tournament.
Or I was going to say he'd win a poker tournament, yeah.
So he'd be able to like, come up with these weird moments where cash just like flies. And I think he's also in a band that could go out on tour at will and make some money, but like, I don't know how much they've made, but like, he had like ways to make money. And it's like, but the studio, it's like, we have to be a studio making money, and like there's ways that we're making money, and there's not going to be like a sudden out of nowhere burst of cash that just shows up. So we kind of have to live within our means. And so just having that period of like morphing from his home studio into like the studio, it took like a few years to get that sort of ironed out. And I'm more conservative about like spending cash just by seeing how easily it can disappear.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, especially when you've kind of started off on your own operationally, just repairing things that others were thinking were trash. And that thriftiness really pays off in so many ways. Fixing things that are broken here in the studio instead of going, well, that's trash, let's just buy another one.
Yeah, and it's kind of by necessity too. And I think like you have to have some sort of flexibility. Like I tell when we have like 3 interns a semester here, and sometimes I talk to like classes, and I think everybody knows this now, but you always have to have like 1 or 2 things in addition to wanting to engineer and record and excel at doing that. Like you should be able to do something else like accounting or web design or studio maintenance or something, like it's just gonna be that way. And like this, the engineer only job or the producer only job is kind of like a unicorn. It's like, there are not too many people that can do that. And if you get to the point where like you've done a couple of hit records and people are super stoked about just hiring you and you're able to just sort of be on that airplane flying high, it's like, that's great. But most people are going to need to have some sort of like some other way to enable yourself to keep recording and doing production work. And I don't think like, I think like I'm at a point where I can make enough money recording bands, but through doing the tech work stuff for, 25 plus years, like there's a lot of like random projects that I can say yes to that are kind of fun and curious, like in studio installations, and they end up paying really well. And it's like, it's like, that's kind of a cool thing.
Not to bring us down, but let's move on to, the cold hard reality. Steve's passing away.
Mm-hmm.
That obviously had that was like a gut punch like none other to all of you. I understand that. I can't imagine anybody who wouldn't understand that. What I'm curious about is did you all just, come together and say, what are we going to do?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things. For the last 4 or 5 years, we were trying to like figure out a plan for him to kind of be less and less sort of involved or need to be involved like day to day, like, because eventually he's going to want to retire or at least cut it down to a minimum at some point. And we always would talk about like what to do and how to prepare for that, or what we would want to do as a studio. And in the meantime, we had a uptick in just other little, not side gigs, but just what we do as a studio, like transfers, analog transfers, and then just had like more freelance work coming through and booking more time. And we sort of try to cater to that a little bit more than we used to, just to squeeze him out of the studio a bit and make it a little less reliant on him. And for the last, 5 or 10 years, it's been more that and a little bit more, self-sustaining, like as far as the studio is concerned. And we also had like a method for solving problems and making decisions that involved all of us. And each one of us at the studio has kind of a dual responsibility. Like first we record and engineer, and then something else. And for Taylor, he runs the office and deals with all the financials and bookings, and he also does the transfer stuff. And for John Sampaulo, he's engineer primarily, and he also does all the manufacturing and some tech work and building maintenance. And Mac does some of the merch stuff, and Brian, another part-time worker, he does like tech work. But everybody engineers, and everybody does one other thing, while they're not engineering. But all the decision making for a while, and I think I can give Taylor some credit for this, like, just as far as like organizationally, whenever there was a decision about modifying the studio some way or buying something big or just any sort of big company-wide decision, we'd all have a consensus around it, just to make sure that no one gets like surprised by any sort of decision. And so we had this problem-solving sort of infrastructure that was sort of set up that didn't have a top-down kind of decision-making process. So it wasn't hard to sort of it wasn't hard to keep that going. And the problem we were trying to solve in this case was just like, what do we do now? And fortunately, we had like a full calendar of bookings that we could just keep satisfying and keep maintaining. And there's maybe like half of the projects that were booked with Steve, they booked with other engineers in the studio just to keep it going. They were still happy to come record here. Some of them were specifically wanted to work with Steve, and when that wasn't possible, they did something else. But half of them still came here and recorded, which is great. It's complicated. So, the business is maintaining, and that's handy, and it's like remarkable that it's still maintaining, and we're meeting our needs, and we're able to pay the bills and all that sort of stuff. And usually every winter there's like a lull in the business, and there's always like some dead and dry months. And this last winter was great, and the calendar looks pretty good, and we're almost a year in now, and it seems to be working pretty well. And the more months that swing by that work and that are successful, and as long as like there's no big upset in the future, like we're still able to like absorb some sort of like random shot from the dark, as far as like once in a while an inspector will come by and say we have the wrong this or that, and we have to buy a new stairwell for the backloading dock or something dumb, just like dumb, like out of nowhere costs, or if the roof develops a leak or a hole in it. It's like we have like a finances to absorb that, and like we're able to deal with these surprise events that come screw us in the air, that sort of stuff.
Is that typical of Chicago, of inspectors showing up to?
I mean, it's I bring it up like it's like typical, but it's really happened twice in 25 years. But like they replaced the water main underneath the street in front of us. And when they did that, they inspected everybody's, feed to the buildings. And we had like a leftover 6-inch plumbing feed. This is like in the weeds, but 6-inch plumbing pipe coming into the building, because we had this elaborate sprinkler system that we don't have anymore. It was for the last business that was here. And even though the city signed off on all the plans for the renovation for the building, the studio, they just like, nope, you need to change that. And so like it cost like $15,000 to replace our main water line going to the studio. And it's like, for a subsistence business, it's like 15 grand a month.
That's a hit.
That's a hit, yeah. But yeah, like we were strategic about like sort of saving money now, and like we took out like during the pandemic, we took out the disaster loan, like maxed it out, just because we had no idea like what the future would be, and like wanted to make sure we had a cushion for however long that would be, and that turned into, that's basically like a business loan, like no other business loan that you get. And it's like at the time you could get a loan for like what people are getting loans for houses for a 30-year term. And so like, I don't know, I was telling people everybody should get that thing, because you're not going to get that thing.
Right. Well, I think it was like, weren't they like 2 or 3%?
Yeah,
something?
and like for 30 years. And so like you're not going to, like as for a business, it's normally like 5 years and 10-year loans, and at a high interest rate. And it's like, so yeah, we just like took advantage of that, which gave us a little bit of like runway in case something else went weird or sideways. But anyways, back to Steve being gone. Obviously, for the emotional side of it, obviously there's like a ton going on, and reconciling like losing a friend that you realize you've been around for all of your adult life. Basically, I started here when I was 19, still processing what that is and figuring out like where that evolves in my brain.
Yeah.
But
it seems like everybody really kind of came together to try to problem solve once again, because you'd had almost, near 30 years of experience of of working with Steve and running this operation, so that it's not like it's falling apart. It's actually staying together, and everybody's coming together to put together a plan, of a continuity plan.
Yeah, and we have there was no sort of like hitch as far as like how do we do these things, like we've been doing these things this whole time. And Steve, for the most part, like kept to himself. He was, like I said, he wasn't like a top-down kind of like boss type person. He would show up for his sessions, and then like, you know, if we'd have any sort of like things that we needed done around the studio, you know, we'd have a little meeting or chat about like how to do it, and you know, share experiences. And but it is weird, like, you know, now that he's gone, I'm kind of like the only person with like the institutional knowledge of like how the place was like built. And it's, I have to start sort of just cataloging certain things, and I'm trying to, you know, force that information on everybody else. Just it's like, this is how this is under this floor. There's this and this. You know, watch out for, you know, if you're drilling into this wall, watch out for that. And it's like, I'm the only guy who might know that might be a thing. But yeah, it's on a personal level. There's one thing happening, and it's like, you know, I was so busy doing stuff, and that's kind of how I deal with all sorts of trouble, is just flooding my schedule with with things to do, and it's already flooded, and so it's not a healthy way to grieve or process stuff, but it's just the way that it ended up. And you know, I've got a family and I've got kids, and I had to make sure you carve time for, you know, that's always, as you know, it's always like a tug and pull as far as like this industry and the work habits of doing session work and the schedules, and doing that family work life is a totally different thing than if you had a 9-to-5 job. And you know, I have my little hacks and ways to deal with it, but yeah, it's a thing everybody has to figure out.
Do you feel the pressure now that Steve's gone, and you, as you said, you're the one with all the institutional knowledge, and if you were to disappear, everybody would be kind of trying to figure out what's what?
Yeah, I mean, I say that just from the sense of being here during construction and just seeing what's underneath the skin of everything. But like, you know, John Sampello's been here 20 years and Taylor's been here 10 years. So there's a lot of like long-term employees. Like there's a good like a extension and roots here. But yeah, that one connection just beyond that little threshold of like pre-construction era, like Steve and I would sort of like talk about certain moments during that period, that like, you know, why the floor in Studio B is like linoleum tile instead of hardwood floor. It's like, you know, because that's what we could afford at the time. It's like it's not by design, but like, yeah, like no one else would know or care about that. Or maybe people might care about that, but that would be like, and now if like, you know, I'm like, okay, well, we should get that hardwood floor in Studio B now that we got the money for it. It's like, what are you talking about? It's great as it is. It's like, no, but that wasn't the plan. It's like,
I have to give props to a friend of mine who's a guest who's been on the show, Jacob Light. He's got a studio in Lafayette where I live called Modern Tone. And Jacob he runs a very small operation, employs several people though, and is the king of creating an operational manual of how his studio runs, because he really excels at teaching others to, here, I wrote this manual, now you read it and you go teach 5 other people who are working at the studio how to do this. Mm-hmm. So he passes along that knowledge.
Nice.
So I don't know, maybe there's an operations manual in your future.
Yeah, the closest thing we have is the intern binder. We have like these binders we give the interns, and it's just like too much information.
Right.
But it's also the stuff that like you realize you walk the interns through the first day or two, and you like show them everything. It's like, you're not gonna remember any of this. It's like it's like we tell them, like, you're not gonna remember any of this. Like, just ask us questions and we're going to repeat it. And like, but here's the book in case you forget and you don't want to ask, or, you know, it's all, you know, all in there. And, but yeah, like, I know that like, we had like this pipe dream of making a little, a book, like a pseudo textbook called like, you know, just studio practices, like, you know, for how we do stuff here. And like, you know, it was always a thing that we thought we wanted to do, but never, you know, it's just like, we're all working like 60-hour jobs. It's like, when is this going to happen? It's like, Steve, you get a draft down because you can write stuff like lightning, and then I'll just put put my bits on it. It's like, we're going to do these, well, we can do this, but it's just like, it's the kind of thing that like everything else in life, like that, that Bluetooth player I've been trying to do. It's like something like I'd work on it like 2 hours every month or so.
Right.
It's like I need to have like, well, I'm gonna have a leg surgery or knee surgery soon. I have like a torn meniscus, and during that layout period, I'm gonna get so much done.
Well, one thing that I'm observing from afar that I don't know if others have picked up on, but one of the things on my show that I preach about all the time on my audiences right now, they're going diversification. Is diversification, because you're running a studio and obviously there's that income, but you've also, it seems like you've gone a little deeper into, the DIs and the mid-side processor, doing the gear, doing the merchandise, the jumpsuits, but also, the transfers, all these little things that are income streams directly related to this studio to help, keep the bank account solid to cover everybody's health insurance and look out for those random inspections from the city, but also just keep everybody employed. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, certainly. I sort of whipped up the idea of just selling gear, just to do these little augmenting sort of bits and pieces, to raise a little bit of money here and there. And also just because people were asking for them. We'd build something like the direct box is something we made the first year that we were in this building. And we made like 8 of them. And it's just a simple Jensen direct box, Jensen transformer direct box, but like with the flexibility of having a throughput for the microphone path and going back and forth, just as an impedance conversion, which was something we didn't, you could get that from a couple of different things that you could buy out in the world, but no one had like all that in one box, like, and with the convenience that we're wanting it. So we just made it for ourselves and just had it laying around. And then people, it's like, oh, I want to get one of the, like when you make one, just let me know. Like, and all right, well, like next time I make a batch, I'll let you know. And like over the years, I'll be like, I forgot who I told this to. I just posted online. I'm just like, I forgot who I told I would make one of these for. If you want one, just email us now. And then like we just started getting flooded with emails. I'm like, okay, I guess I'm making like, and I could only make like 50 or 60 at the time, and we just got flooded with emails. And I'm like, okay, I guess we can try to like think about making a bunch of these for sale, which we started doing during the pandemic. And I was like at home with my wife doing these things, and then and like everybody had a hand in doing it. Like I just make Steve write the legend on the actual box, just because I have bad handwriting, and people like the way his handwriting looks, and now there's always like there's some hand in everything, everybody doing everything. And then the mic preamp is something we made a batch of back in 2012, and it's a preamp that I made at my house in my home studio for my Sony MXP 3000 console, which is all modular. You could get like a preamp from API and put it in there, and EQ from different options and stuff. And I bought that board so that I could like hot rod it, and I made a preamp for that. And so I brought that preamp here, and it's like we don't have a lot of transformer based preamps in Studio B. Should I make like a batch for here? And we did like this hybrid sort of preamp EQ module, and that again like was working really well in here. It's like, well, let's make a batch and try to sell them. And we made a batch and sold a batch, back then. And then now, just before Steve died, like we sort of ironed out the 500 series version of it. And it's like, okay, let's do more of this sort of thing. And it's that, the transfers, the merch, like, and just, we're doing these, like, we're starting to do like these in Studio A, in the big live room. We're having these sort of intimate sort of shows once in a while. And we're starting to do that a little bit more. Just these little like things just to, that helps keep the ball rolling. And also like, I just like the idea that there's hundreds of our things in other people's studios. Like, I like going to a studio and seeing like our direct box or our preamp, and randomly just when I'm out recording, doing some freelance gig, and it's like, oh, that came from our place. That's kind of like a weird sort of spreading out in the world of like an actual thing that's going to last hopefully forever and a long time anyways. But it's a nice satisfying thing to see just on that level. But yeah, there's just all those sort of like things that we know how to do that we can do well, or not just kind of foisting garbage out there. At least I'm not trying to foist any garbage out there. I'm foisting out stuff that like I'm have a lot of pride in, and like want to maintain this sort of like caliber of the studio's reputation as being a place that is trying to function well and be utilitarian and wise. And,
I see it as a kind of a hub of some sorts, and I associate the name Electrical Audio. Like if I was to come record here, I know it would be quality, and I know if I were to buy a piece of gear, I know it would be quality. So there's definitely a thing, and I can't be the only one that thinks that. There's got to be
2 or 3 more people.
There's got to be at least 4 more, right?
Right.
No, but seriously, I do think a lot of people think of this place in that way. There's only one of you, and I have to just thank you in advance for taking the time to do this with me today, because I'm sure you're super, super fucking busy.
Like the bifurcated lifestyle that I have, like the recording life, the tech life, and the freelance recording life, and the freelance tech life, that's not bifurcated, that's quadrificated or something.
Right, and the parent life.
And the parent life, yeah, that too, that's important, right?
That is.
When I'm recording, I kind of finally settled on like it's like being in a 12-hour meeting where you can't really like talk to anyone else or do other things. You can't, or sometimes you can send emails and texts and stuff, but like a lot of the time your full attention is required, and you're like interacting with people almost 100% of the time. And so it's a taxing sort of lifestyle. And then when I have a day when I'm not doing that and I'm doing tech work or other stuff where I can just be free to do stuff like this, like talk to you, it's like great. After this, I'm going to go to a friend's, this freelance producer engineer, Cooper Crane, who's done a bunch of stuff here. He's really great, working for all sorts of records for Drag City Records here in Chicago. And he just bought a tape machine, and he wants me to check it out with him. And so it's like, for me, that's kind of like a fun thing. I get to hang out with him and look at a fancy tape machine that he just got, and then I go home and hang out with the kids. It's like one of those, when I'm not doing a recording session, I feel like I have a day off, even though I'm not fully free. And like, so if I'm able to have some control of my day-to-day stuff, I feel like it's a day off. It's like a release in a weird way. Like, I love recording and I love doing that, but you see a pileup of things that you're not getting done in the other parts of your life. And so it's like, it's nice to have a day off where I'm only working a little bit.
How old are your kids?
9 and then soon to be 11.
In short, do you have any recommendations to others on how to handle this life and be a family man as well, or a family woman?
For me, what's worked, and I'm not always able to do this because I do a lot of like back-to-back shorter sessions. But if I have a session that's like 5 days or longer, that's really easy to do. I just communicate to the band that like every other day I'm going to go home and eat dinner with my family, or go home at roughly 5 to 7 during that time. And whether it's a dinner or not, I'll go home like for an hour or so. And I live close enough to do that, thankfully. And so when I do that, I can spend time, it's like it's a token amount of time to spend with the family. It's not legitimate, like, I'm a father, and here's how you cut a piece of wood, and I'm going to help you put together this puzzle. I'm like there to be like, I'm here. How's your day? But I get to come back, and for me, it relieves the pressure for some reason. Like, and when I'm back, I don't worry about going a little bit later. The schedule here at the studio, and I've adopted this in my personal life, it's like I don't have any fixed, rigid, like time limits. So it's like roughly a session at this point for me is like 9 to 10 hours. And then if it goes to 11, no big deal. It used to be like, 12 to 14 hours. And you learn pretty quickly that doesn't work that well for a lot of, other reasons, just for energy wise. And maintaining like over a long period of time, it's counterproductive. But I sort of cap it at like, 12 at the most, 12 hours in a day. But if I go home and visit with the family and do that sort of thing, then come back, I'm not so worried about going a little bit later, and I feel better about it. And then on the freelance end of things, whenever I can, whenever I've been able to, I try to take everybody with me. And so if I'll go to we've done this where I go to Montreal and work at a studio up there, and like the family, if they're free, if school's out, if it's the summertime, like we'll just go up there and spend the entire time there, and I'll work up there and then come home to an Airbnb. They'll be going to parks and doing stuff all day and having fun, my wife and kids, and we just have the freedom to kind of do that, and that's great, like outside of the school year. And then I don't feel like I'm just like completely abandoning family, and they're having like a fun experience or a weird experience anyway. And it seems to work out a lot better. Like we've done that a number of times, like as they've been kids growing up to now. I try to drag them along with me, whether it's a tech trip or a recording trip, and it kind of keeps me connected. And like, cause I'll still go on trips without them, and like if I'm gone for 2 weeks, it's a real drag, as you can imagine. But when I get to drag them with me, it's like the kids are having this weird experience that later on, hopefully they'll appreciate.
You remember when Dad dragged us to that weird place in Montreal?
Yeah, I remember when we went to the Catskills, or I went to Western Illinois in this town called Savannah, and it's like, one of those river towns that's just like kind of economically depressed, and it's like, half the buildings are abandoned, and like it's on the Mississippi River, and the river floods half the city every year, and it's just like this weird space that's kind of cool and creepy, and but like, I was there helping a friend install a studio in his new like home studio, and like we were there for like 6 days, and they went to a couple national parks, and we just like spent time in a place that we'd never go to. There'd be no reason to go there. And it's funny, they go back to school and brag about how they were in Savannah, Illinois. Not Savannah, Georgia, it's Savannah, Illinois. And it's like, what are you talking about? No one knows anything about that. And the kids are always like talking about going on like these vacations to these like weird little towns here and there that like no one knows anything about, and they're not really vacations, they're just, you're there. They're just spending time there.
These are all going to be questions that come up in years to come when they're older. So why did you really bring us there, Dad?
Yeah. I didn't trust you at home with your mother.
Well, we're just about done here, but
Yeah.
I got to ask, what are the challenges that you guys are facing, even though you are a fairly in-demand studio and group of people?
Yeah, so we're humming along pretty good, but obviously like, the economy is probably going to tank in the next half a year or sooner or later, who knows. And we've weathered, I don't know how many recessions, but not a dictatorship so much. And we've definitely seen, just anecdotally, like all the stuff that I buy for the preamps and everything like that, like, the tariffs are real.
Tariffs are affecting the purchase of equipment.
We have a very expensive op amp that, already is expensive and annoying that that it sounds good. I, did like you do, you'd try a bunch of different amps and see which ones you like the sound of. And unfortunately, the one that I liked the sound of was expensive, and it's, it was like $45, and now it's like $55. It's like, and it's a chip op amp that like, nothing is 100% made in China or one of these places, but materials are always borrowed. And then obviously companies are just padding their costs just by increasing the, price just under the cover of like, oh yeah, prices are going up, all the tariffs. Like they can just say, tariff and raise the prices if they can get away with it. But whatever. So those are, there's unexpected stuff. We have like some, runway, some cushion as far as that's concerned, but we're all pretty wide, like open-eyed about anything can happen in the future. And none of us want to see this place disappear. It'd be great if like, obviously wonderful to have like a secure future, like knowing that like we're going to be fine for like 10, 15, 20 years, you know. But it's just, the reality is we just got to keep plugging away and make sure we pay the bills and make it a viable sort of business that pays for itself, basically. It's interesting, like most studios that are pretty well funded and done, like that have like nice stuff, there's always like some weird millionaire backer, and we never like had that. Like, I'm sure people believe Steve's a millionaire, and he would have been technically a millionaire based on like the amount of crap in the studio and the studio building itself and owning the facility, just the equity being a millionaire. But like, you know, he's still, you know, a normal like wage earner as far as like, you know, just by providing a service, like we were able to pay the bills. It wasn't like, all right, I gotta throw in another $250,000 to keep the studio alive. You know, like the building's like, you know, maintaining itself, and I don't see that in a lot of other places that are a big place, you know, a big facility. It's usually like someone's pet project, or, you know, some angel investor is like dumping a ton of money in there somehow, or some weird.
So the lesson I would assume here is that sure, anybody can assemble a bunch of gear and in a building, but to run it as a successful business over the years, there's got to be a plan, and there's got to be an infrastructure that supports the ongoing life of that studio.
Yeah, and a culture and a community around it. Like we've, you know, got lots of bands that have, and musicians and friends that have worked here like the entire time. Like one of my first, I would do these test sessions here, like, you know, when we just opened up, when the studio was just finished. Myself and the other engineer who was with us at the time, like we were encouraged to just, you know, have bands come in and do test sessions and just get our chops down and everything. And one of the first bands I recorded here was the 90 Day Men, which is a local band. I'd say local band. They're from Chicago, and they just did their like 20th anniversary box set or something. Maybe 28 years. I think it's 20 years. But anyways, you know, Brian Case, one of the members in that band, has been recording here pretty much the entire time throughout to, you know, like last year. It's actually in a band called Fax, and that was like the last band Steve was recording just before he died. And it's just, there's like hundreds of people like him that have been here, you know, over the last couple of decades, that just like come in here and feel comfortable here. And there's not like a corporate, there's no receptionist, there's not a corporate sort of vibe. It's like they come in, there's like, everybody kind of knows that we're kind of part of this experience, and we're doing everything ourselves, and everything that they see is a product of something that we've come up with, and it's not something that we hired out to do. And, you know, and I kind of get the environment and the culture, and we're kind of part of that community, which is, you know, a really great one in Chicago for sure.
Yeah, I've only been to Chicago a few times in my life, and what I know of Chicago and my experiences in Chicago, this to me kind of embodies that kind of, I don't know, there's a Midwestern work ethic going on here, and there's definitely a community, and it's really cool to see it in person and be here, and especially meet you and just take it all in. It's pretty amazing. So I appreciate, you know, your time and taking us on that long ass tour, which I really enjoyed, and I think everybody else is going to enjoy. So audience, if you haven't watched the tour, watch the tour. And
feel free to use Melodyne to pitch shift my voice up with like inflections and stuff, you know.
Beat detect. You're a little off in your performance.
I do have pitch variations, but they're real subtle. You can use an expander to bring it out, you know. The real drama comes into expanding those pitches.
I think so. I think we'll do that. But actually, in all seriousness, thank you, Greg. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right. You take care.
Thanks.